Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, Scotland paves the way for legal targets on nature, while ramblers there say more money is needed to ensure the right to roam.
We risk having world-class access rights and a third-class system to actually make sure those are delivered on the ground.
More on that later. Let's start, though, with our theme for the week, new entrants. These are the people who come into farming with no family farm to work on or inherit. The vast majority of farmers who own land pass it on to other members of the family, so it can be hard for people from outside the industry to get hold of land. And land is, of course, expensive, which forms another barrier. Tenant farms, where all or some of the land is rented, make up about a third of English farmland. But getting a tenancy is hard work and, again, requires some capital. Well, this week we'll hear from new entrants on how they've made it work. But let's start with a rural charity which is trying to help. The Addington Fund is best known for providing subsidised housing in rural areas and help in emergencies. But it set up a new entrant scheme. Jo Webb from the fund told me what's on offer.
First of all, we're offering grants worth up to £3,000 for 18 to 40-year-olds who've started farming in the last 5 years. The second thing that we're offering is what we hope will, in the future, become a raft of starter farms across England and Wales. And we're currently restoring a farmhouse in Cumbria, which we hope to open for applications for new entrants into farming around about March or April time.
And the idea there being to give people a chance to rent a sort of a starter farm, if you like, a little bit like the old council farm system used to work.
Yes, very similar. The successful tenant will receive the support that they need to help them to develop not just a great farm, but also a viable farming business and an opportunity really that they can apply for bigger and better things, move on, and we will then use the farm to help the next generation.
What do you think are the barriers at the moment for people who want to try and get into it?
I think the barriers are probably the high cost of land. You have to have significant funds to acquire any land, but also rentals, renting land, renting farms, they're not as commonplace as they used to be. And I think if you are the child in a family farm and you have siblings, that reduces your opportunity as well. It can be quite damaging to a farm to split it when it passes between generations.
Your charity, more than anyone, will know how hard farming can be. What are the attractions of a career in farming for new entrants?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we come across farmers whose children really aren't interested. They've seen them devoting their life 24/7 really to their farm. But actually, it's a wonderful lifestyle for many. And some people are just not interested in sitting in the four white walls of an office. It can be such a rewarding career, and there are opportunities to build not just what people think traditionally of a farm, but a really successful rural business. And if you have the passion for high quality food production, and you can marry that with some business acumen, there's no reason that you couldn't have an absolutely fabulous profession in farming.
Jo Webb from the Addington Fund. Now, the right to roam in Scotland, which allows access to most of the country's land, is being hollowed out by a lack of money, according to a new report from the walkers group Ramblers Scotland. It says that some of the essential infrastructure needed to ensure the rights of both walkers and land managers has disappeared, with too few local staff to handle issues when people don't stick to the rules and not enough money spent on maintaining paths. Richard Baines has been out for a walk with Brendan Paddy, the director of Ramblers Scotland.
What we're seeing here on this key national path, we're seeing aggregate being washed off the path, and even the fabric that when the path was built was under that aggregate, and it's now here washed up against a fence along with a lot of the aggregate you can hear crunching under our feet, and there's not much left on the path.
One of the criticisms in the Ramblers Scotland report is that our national trails, such as the West Highland Way, have no dedicated funding. That has to be done by local authorities or national parks. This stretch of the way here in Stirlingshire is in particularly bad shape.
Most of the aggregate has been washed off, to the side of the trail. You're seeing people walking on either side of deep, long puddles.
The lack of funds for national trails like this one is just one symptom of what you're calling a collapse in outdoor funding.
Yeah, and shockingly, it's not just the national trails that have no money. There is literally no money at national level for the maintenance and develop of leisure paths. It just doesn't exist, and that means they're just getting worse and worse. And cash-strapped local authorities and overstretched rangers and access officers are just struggling to keep things together. So the access officers mostly work in local authorities, but also in the national parks, and what they do is help fix problems before they really become too bad. And that's really critical to the system, and we've seen the number of access officers halved since the access legislation was passed.
Now, farmers and land managers are going to be particularly concerned about that lack of access officers, and in some places the lack of access forums.
Yeah, I think it's really critical to remember that this isn't just a problem for people who want to visit the outdoors for walking or for any other things. This is a huge problem for farmers and land managers because the money just isn't there to fix practical problems that they might have on their land, but also if there is a conflict, that access officer who can be your honest broker and sort things out without having to go to court just isn't there anymore in some cases. It was so overstretched they don't have time to do that job. So what we're calling for is a £50 million fund over 5 years of the next Scottish Parliament, and what we wanted to do is fix problems like the ones we're seeing here today, but also on local paths up and down the country. But we're also saying we need to properly fund those access posts because they're critical to sorting out problems before they get really difficult.
So in response to the report, COSLA, which represents Scotland's local authorities, said their funding from Scottish Government remains insufficient to cover rising demand for services. There must be some sympathy for them there.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we know that government finances are squeezed, particularly at local authority levels, but equally we've made a national commitment to have an access framework that really delivers for Scotland. We risk having world-class access rights and a third-class system to actually make sure those are delivered on the ground.
So there are some bodies which are doing pretty well. I mean, the two national parks here in Scotland have at least half a dozen access officers between them. So it's pretty patchy, isn't it?
Yeah, so what we saw in the results from all of the access authorities across Scotland is 32 local authorities, most of which frankly are struggling. There's a few honourable exceptions, but also the two national parks. Now they are better resourced, but they also of course have a large patch to take care of where there's a great deal of recreation.
Stirling Council pointed out it spent £116,000 on West Highland Way upgrades in the last 2 years, and cash for maintenance is limited. The Scottish Government, meanwhile, said in response to the report that it takes the responsibility of looking after our scenery seriously and promotes the Scottish Outdoor Access Code. It said access-related services and infrastructure are best led at a local level.
Richard Baines reporting there. Scotland has introduced legislation to set legal targets to reverse the decline in nature. The Scottish Government says this will ensure that the country is on a bold, ambitious journey to be nature positive by 2030. The Natural Environment Bill, which was passed by the Scottish Parliament last week, also gives ministers new powers over land use and deer management. Kevin Keane, BBC Scotland's environment correspondent.
Scotland actually is one of the most nature-depleted countries anywhere in the world. And back in 2023, there was this report published called the State of Nature Report. And it said that there'd been a 15% decline in average species abundance since 1994. And that in the last decade alone, 43% of many, many species had declined strongly. So things like swifts, greenfinch, kestrels, curlew, lapwing. There is a problem that's been identified here. Nature is very much in decline. We often hear politicians, conservationists and others talking about how we have to tackle both the climate change problem and the nature loss problems hand in hand. Of course, we know that there have long been targets for tackling climate change, and I suppose in a sense this puts that nature loss into that same category.
Targets, though, are often missed. Will the expectations be different in Scotland?
Yeah, I suppose the difference with this is that these are legally binding targets rather than just kind of government ambitions. And the targets themselves have not actually been set yet, so that comes in secondary legislation. But once they are set, one of the things that we know that they'll include is a commitment to be what's called nature positive by 2030. And that of course, is the point at which we halt that nature loss and start to have kind of nature recovery across across the piece. And with the Scottish Parliament elections in May this year, that target therefore comes at the end of that next parliamentary term. So the next government, whoever that may be, will then be held to account for that target. What does legally binding mean? Well, if the target is missed, it means that the minister will have to come to the Scottish Parliament and explain themselves, but also alongside that publish a credible plan to get those targets back on track. Now, that is what happened with the climate change targets that the Scottish Government kept on missing. They ended up pretty much coming unstuck with that because they couldn't then find a credible way to get those targets back on track, and so they had to face the humiliation, not just the SNP, but it was an SNP Green government at the time, of having to abandon those targets and then set new ones. Of course, that didn't stop the targets being missed, but it did introduce that layer of accountability for them.
Now, this bill also ushers in new powers for ministers on land use and on deer. What impact is that expected to have?
In Scotland, Charlotte, deer are seen as one of the primary barriers to this issue of nature restoration. We've got more than 1 million deer, probably about half of the UK's total population. They cause a huge amount of damage in the countryside. So these new powers will hopefully help land managers and others get on top of deer numbers, making it easier to cull them, creating control zones in areas where there's a particular problem identified, a strategy to encourage more of us to eat venison. But ultimately, this wider package is about reducing those deer numbers to try to give nature itself some kind of a fighting chance of being restored.
Kevin Keane. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Rebecca Rooney. And Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.